G'day, and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. Today we will be discussing whether or not divine simplicity is as contradictory as that beer cup was, as the beer was pouring in. And we have Father Pine and Joe Schmid to be discussing this topic. I'm super glad to have them here. Really glad you're here as well. Thank you so much. If you're new to Pints with Aquinas, please think about, give it a think over about subscribing. Don't have to, just an option for you. You can click subscribe and that bell button, and that way Google will be forced to let you know whenever we put out a new video. All right. Father Pine and Joe, what's up?
How's it going?
Hey, it's good. It's good to see you. You need to tell us about your shirt.
Yes, this is my favorite shirt. One's Modus Ponens, another's Modus Trollens.
Nice.
It's like perfect. Love it.
Now, I know you're not a Catholic, but would you be in favor of different Catholic religious orders adopting something like that on their habit? It would just spruce it up a bit. Yours is a bit boring, Father Pine. It's just white.
Yeah, I was thinking about maybe getting like a little patch, something like that.
Yes. My other shirt, my second favorite shirt, actually has an existential quantifier on the front, so maybe you
Okay. I don't know what that means, but I'm just going to laugh. That's great. It's people smarter than me will. It's lovely to have you both here. Thank you both for agreeing to do this. This is a pleasure. Maybe before we begin, and we're going to have Father Pine is going to begin with an opening statement, then Joe, just for those of you who are watching, and then we're going to have about 45 minutes where the two of you just get to have a conversation together. I mean, this is a really difficult topic to understand, right? I mean, divine simplicity, when you're talking about different doctrines within Christianity, whether it's coherent or not, we shall see, it's a bloody difficult one, and so I'm really looking forward to learning from you guys, and I know a lot of people are excited about this. After that 45-minute back and forth, we're going to have a time about 30 minutes where you can ask your questions if you're watching here in the live chat or over on Patreon to make sure we see it, make it a super chat, and we'll ask those, and then the ones over on Patreon. And then we'll conclude with about 5-minute statements. So that's where we're going today. Before we begin, if you guys could just take a minute to say who you are and where people can find you. Joe?
Yeah, so I'm Joe. I do both scholarly and popular level work in philosophy. So on the scholarly level, I've published numerous articles in international peer-reviewed philosophy journals on topics in philosophy of religion, models of God, metaphysics, and philosophy of time. I've also published a book, shameless self-promotion.
Hey,
I published a book.
Look at it.
The Majesty of Reason, a short guide to critical thinking in philosophy. Does just that. It's a guide to critical thinking. And yeah, lots of other philosophy stuff. So that's on the scholarly level. On the popular level, I have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason, where I host discussions with philosophers like Josh Rasmussen, Graham Oppie, Rob Koons, and all sorts of good people. And I also make super cool lecture videos. So I did one recently on Alex Pruse's entry in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology on the Leibnizian cosmological argument. It was so fun. I put memes in there. It's so fun. And then I guess I should probably add finally that I study philosophy at Purdue University, and we have some great philosophers here like Paul Draper, Mike Bergman, Jeff Brower, and many more.
Nice. And you're an agnostic, correct? That's how you would kind of define yourself religiously? Or no?
Yeah, epistemically or epistemically or doxastically or propositionally agnostic, yes. But the existential side is much different and too complicated. So
Okay, good. All right. Father Pine, who are you? Tell us about your excellent podcast, Godsplaining, as well.
Dig. Let's see. I am Catholic, and I'm a Catholic priest. And I'm a student at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, and which is between Geneva and Zurich, which are on like opposite sides of the country. So I just I named half of the territory of Switzerland, so that's not actually helpful. Let's see. I'm a Dominican friar. I entered the order in 2010. I was ordained in 2016. I'm studying dogmatic theology, specifically Christology and soteriology. Soteriology just means the study of salvation, how it works, how it's applied. And I used to serve as the blah, 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 and thus and such of the Tomistic Institute, and which has a lot of great resources for learning the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And then I contribute to a podcast called Godsplaining with 4 other Dominican friars. And those are 30-minute conversations, and they're in a kind of more popular register. So just kind of contemplative insights on things of faith, life, literature, politics,
you remind me
culture,
of Jim
whatever.
from The Office, who says, and I'm boring myself even talking about it. But it's not boring. It's really interesting. And speaking of Godsplaining, why don't you begin whenever you're ready, if you are ready, to Godsplain to us about divine simplicity. Whenever you begin, Father, I'm going to click a timer for 18 minutes. You can take as much of that as you like. Was that too abrupt a transition? I'm sorry.
No, it's great.
Okay.
No, that's wonderful.
All right. Are you? Whenever you start, I'll click the start timer.
Okay, perfect. So the topic for today is divine simplicity. And to just start with a basic definition of divine simplicity that I think many people would agree to. So just to start with a doctrinal definition. So for Catholics, this is a matter of revealed faith, and it's been pronounced upon at the Fourth Lateran Council, which took place in the 13th century. And then again, it was reaffirmed at Vatican I, which took place in the 19th century. And the teaching is that God is an altogether simple substance or nature. The idea there is that God is not composed of parts. And sometimes philosophers will enumerate neither physical nor metaphysical parts. So parts of whatever sort. And as a result of which, God is simple, uncomplex. So it is at root a negative claim. But as we'll see, it's also content rich insofar as it follows from other claims that those in this tradition will advance. So broadly, like within a kind of Catholic setting, it's motivated by scriptural revelation. And I know that, philosophers and theologians, contemporary philosophers and theologians have talked about that at greater length. But then it's something that gets picked up in the tradition and is pondered by St. Augustine and then becomes a hot topic in the Middle Ages. And so I'm going to follow the exposition of St. Thomas Aquinas in a particular way because as I have self-described in the past, I'm just a Tomistic hack. So let's situate then the doctrine of divine simplicity within St. Thomas's thought more broadly. So you know that the Summa Theologiae is divided into three main parts, the first of which concerns God, creation, angels, man, things like that, divine governance as well. Second part of which concerns the moral life, and it's divided into principles of the moral life and then the virtues. And then the third part treats Christ, the sacraments, and St. Thomas intended to get to the last things, but he laid down his pens before he did. So the doctrine of divine simplicity is covered in the first part. It's covered in the treatise on God. So the first part begins with a short question on methodology. It treats specifically Sacra Doctrina. Sacra Doctrina meaning, holy teaching or sacred doctrine. And people have argued as to what exactly that means, but there seems to be some agreement that it has something to do with theology. Some people would say that it just is theology. So this is a theological setting in the sense that St. Thomas doesn't draw hard and fast distinctions between the practice of philosophy and theology. So he's already introduced revealed principles into the conversation. But what we'll do for the most part is philosophical, insofar as you don't really need to grant revealed principles in order to probe the doctrine or in order to unpack it to some extent. So then St. Thomas goes from there to question 2, where he talks about the existence of God. And this for him is a matter of prosecuting an Aristotelian science. So in an Aristotelian science, you have to proceed in an orderly way and prove first that the thing is, before you subsequently go on to describe what it is and then prove whether it is, and then kind of demonstratively that it is such. So in question 2, he's proving that his subject matter exists. So the famous question 2, article 3 is devoted to the 5 ways. And in kind of leading up to that, he wants to show that this is, while evident in itself, it's not necessarily evident to everyone. And so you're going to have to do some work in order to produce the results that you need to bring along with you throughout the rest of the treatise devoted to God, the one God, the triune God. So then he goes on, to prove these things rigorously, as it were. The arguments that he makes are arguments that argue from effect to cause. So he refers to them as argues quia, which is to say argues that, rather than arguments propter quid, is on account of which, as it were. So it's a type of argument that goes from what is more known to us, as it were, to then what is less known to us but more knowable in itself. And you have to kind of glean some content from the 5 ways in order really to follow the argument about divine simplicity, because St. Thomas deploys what he has arrived at in the 5 ways as conclusions. He deploys those things kind of as principles in the conversation about divine simplicity. So just like short rehearsals then of some of the 5 ways as a way to get some footing or get some purchase on the things that we're going to deploy in the conversation about simplicity. So in the first way, which St. Thomas says is the most manifest way because it's the closest to our experience in a certain sense, St. Thomas begins with the observation that there are things in the world that change. So for him, it's the argument from motion, and motion describes change of a certain sort. So he understands that there be four basic kinds of change: change in substance, change in place, change in quantity, and change in quality. He thinks that change in substance poses its own particular problems, but that we can group the three other sorts of change together, and we'll just refer to them as motion. And then the main philosophical insight that's at play in this particular argument is the insight of act and potency. So this is something that Aristotle would have arrived at in his own consideration of change in the physics, and which St. Thomas brings up. So it's a principle derived from natural philosophy. So it's kind of on its way to metaphysics and certainly deployed in metaphysics, but it's kind of more basic. And basically, those things are actual, which express, exhibit, or kind of be in a particular way. And those things are potential, which are not yet, but have the capacity to be so. And so he observes that, in the first way, that things go from being not yet to wholly so. For that transition to take place, in order for that change to transpire, there needs to be some agent which brings it about, because a thing can't make itself to be. It can't pull itself up by its own metaphysical bootstraps. And so what he establishes on this basis is a kind of causal series in which, C is caused by B and B is caused by A, etc. I suppose I should have started with a later letter. Etc. kind of taps out before A. Right. And what he says is, when we observe this type of series, that not only is it the fact that B causes C or that A causes B, but also that their causing is itself dependent. So here he's not talking about like a father begets a son and a son begets a grandson, which he would say is an accidentally subordinated series of causes. He's talking about an essentially subordinated series of causes, or a per se subordinated series of causes. So we're talking more about like links in a chandelier. How is it that the lowest link supports the chandelier? Well, it's borne up, as it were, by the next one, right? Or the next lowest link. And so too, he says, when we observe motion in reality, that we need some causal ground or causal basis whereby this motion is intelligible and whereby any of its causality actually obtains. So what he's looking for there is something that is wholly actual. And what he arrives at is the unmoved mover. So the big thing there is the fact of God's being wholly actual. Now, in the second way, he argues in similar fashion to an uncaused cause. And he deploys, a kind of similar mode of argumentation. So I'm just going to skip over that and pick up a little bit from the third way and the fourth way, and then we'll roll into simplicity. So in the third way, he observes that some things are contingent and some things are necessary. The basic idea there with contingency is that things are in this way, but they could have been otherwise, right? And if you kind of take that all the way down to metaphysical bedrock, some 20th century philosophers will say, why is there anything rather than nothing? So how do you explain the fact of there being anything at all? Okay. But what he's working with here is just the fact that some things are and could be otherwise, and some things are and couldn't be otherwise. And how do we ground that? And what you have operative here, so we saw with the first way, the kind of principal distinction was between act and potency. Here, it seems to me, the principal distinction, although it doesn't come up in an explicit sense like it does in other arguments for the existence of God, is the composition of essence and existence. So this distinction between what a thing is and that a thing is, so that they are conceptually distinct, and in reality, as we experience it, or in certainly material reality, it seems to be the case that no one thing gives a sufficient causal explanation for itself. So that a thing is accounted for by some prior explanation or some prior cause, because we can kind of note or remark differences between, say, like the phoenix and the dodo and the penguin. Okay, so like a phoenix is, we have an idea, a notion of the essence of a phoenix from having read Harry Potter, and yet a phoenix never was and may never be. A dodo, we have some notion of what that is based on archaeology and the observations of like 19th century natural scientists, but it was and is no longer. And then a penguin, right? Many of us have not been to Antarctica. I suspect that all of us have not been to Antarctica, right? But we know what a penguin is and that it is. So based on this fact of our being able to distinguish them mentally, epistemologically, right? That's rooted in the fact of our being able to distinguish them metaphysically. That's a little bit fast and loose, but that's the basic shape. So what he argues to there is some source of their isness, who himself subsists in isness, to speak somewhat improperly. So he's looking for something that is not composed of essence and existence, something that just subsists, as it were, in being. So whose very nature it is to be. And that's what he arrives at, basically at the end of the third way. And then the fourth way, which is different, because the first three ways, some authors will group them together and call them cosmological arguments, because they begin with a certain kind of observation about reality, about the cosmos. But some authors will refer to this fourth way as the henological argument, which is taken from a way in which Aristotle refers to equivocation, pros hen equivocation, towards one. But it's like kind of at root, it's a more Platonic form of argument. And basically what we see in reality is gradation. So some things take a particular property, as it were, or a particular divine attribute like wisdom. Some things are less wise, some things are more wise. And he says that in order for this to obtain, there has to be some utmost and highest. And he deploys there a principle that he borrows from Aristotle's metaphysics called maxime tale, where the utmost is actually the causal source of the things that exist in this gradation of being, because it's the ground of their intelligibility. So St. Thomas interprets maxime tale in a kind of wild way. And we won't go into that, because now we're just going to go into divine simplicity. And the point of rehearsing those arguments, when, this isn't a debate about the existence of God, it's a debate about simplicity, is because they're just good for argumentative clarification, and because they set us up well to do the type of work that St. Thomas does with simplicity. So in introducing this question 3, which is the next question that comes in the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas says, all right, we've answered on sit, but now we have to answer quid sit, what God is. He says, problem is, it's really hard to do that with God. Truth be told, you can't do that in a straightforward way. And those of you who are familiar with these different traditions in theology, the apophatic, which is a kind of negative knowledge, and cataphatic, which is a more positive knowledge, will hear hints of that tension. So he says, what we're doing here is going to say how God is not, quo modo non sit. So we're going to rule out false conceptions of God so as to kind of circumscribe the mystery. And in questions 3 through 11, that's what he does when he's talking about simplicity, perfection, goodness, immutability, eternity, omnipresence, like unity, things like that, infinity. These are all kind of negative claims, as it were. So simplicity is to remove composition in God. So then what he proceeds to is to describe in eight articles what it means to say that God is simple. And what he sets up is a kind of exhaustive dialectic. So he imagines all the different ways in which it could be said that God is composed, and then he removes each of those ways. And then by the time he gets to Article 7, he says, we've kind of done the bulk of the work, but then I can trot out some further encompassing explanations. And then in Article 8, he says, also, God doesn't enter into composition with other things. So then just a brief word on some of those arguments, and then we'll hand it over. So the first two cover how God is not a body and how God is not composed of matter and form. And here we see how it follows from the conclusions that he's drawn in the first two ways. So it'd be contrary to the nature of an unmoved mover to have a body, because a body cannot be a movens non motum. A body cannot be a moving non-moved. So too, it's just not proper to a first being, as it were, to be a body or to be composed of matter in form. So he goes on to subsequently argue that a body is necessarily in potency. At the very least, it's in potency to the division of its parts. So if it's extended, right, then it can be divided. And then he'll also use the conclusion that he has drawn from the fourth way, namely that God is most noble and that bodies are not most noble. Because what do we see in our own case? We are composed of matter and form, body and soul. And the body, he says, is evidently for the soul. And as a result of which it's subordinated to it, or as it were, it's more proper to say that the soul contains the body than that the body contains the soul, which he takes from Aristotle. So next, he passes on to considerations of composition that are a little more, what will one say, a little more abstract. So these would be like the metaphysical parts, as it were. And in Articles 3 and 4, which we can group together, he says that God is not composed of essence and supposit, nor is he composed of essence and existence. So in our experience of reality, right, we know there to be a composition between these things. So there's like a difference between being humanity and being this human being, which would be an instance of the first case. In our particular experience, we're individuated by matter, but that's not the case with God. But the way in which he transcends this distinction is even more profound, I guess, or exalted, to take it from opposite vantages. So what he's saying there is effectively that God is his Godhead, or that God is his deity. So there's no genre or genus of deity to which God pertains as a member. It's just that God exhausts all that there is of Godhead. God subsists, as it were, in the nature of Godhead. And then with respect to essence and existence, this he thinks flows from an understanding of God as pure act, which is what we arrived at effectively with the third way, so that God is wholly realized and seeks for no further realization, as it were, whether from without or from within. So if God were composed of essence and existence, then he says existence must either be caused by an interior principle or an exterior principle. So an interior principle of God, as it were, or some exterior principle. But he says God is the first efficient cause, which he arrived at the end of the second way. And furthermore, there's no potency in God, as it were, and he's able to kind of rule out both of these options. And then again, using insights from the fourth way, he says, if God isn't his essay, then he participates it, but that's repugnant to the understanding that he has established to this point. And then third and final thing, and then just the last word, is that there can't be accidents in God. And there are a lot of, I suppose, involved problems in 20th and 21st century philosophical exchanges on precisely this point. But the basic idea here is accidents comes from the Latin accidere, which means to befall. So we think about substance being one of the 10 categories, and then the other 9 categories all being accidents. So quantity, quality, relation, habit, posture, time, place, action, passion. And none of these things befall God, as it were. None of these things happen to God, for God himself is very being subsisting through himself. Ipsum esse per se subsistens. So there is nothing that remains to be added to God, because God happens, as it were. There's nothing that happens to him. So that's just a basic summary of the way in which St. Thomas arrives at his conclusions and the principles, as it were, that he deploys in his argumentation. And yes, I think that's my time.
All right. Thank you very much. Joe, whenever you want to begin, I'll set the alarm for 18 minutes.
Okay, let me get my alarm up as well.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Take your time.
Let me pull up my notes. All right. So thank you for having me on. I'm really excited for this. So as I understand divine simplicity, and as classical theist scholars like Grant and Rogers and Dolezal and Bergman, Brouwer, Kerr, and others point out, divine simplicity says roughly, among other things, that everything in God is God. So whatever is within God is identical with God. We could put this more precisely as whatever is intrinsic to God is identical with God. And an intrinsic feature characterizes something in virtue of the way it is in itself, like not how it is in its relations or lack thereof to something external. So to quote Kate Rogers, she says, God simply is an act. So God's identical to all of his actions, and he's identical to all of his properties, so to speak. There's nothing within God that is distinct from God. And so under this understanding of parts, a part of something is any positive ontological item, that is anything with like positive reality, like being or existence or whatever. A part of something is any positive ontological item intrinsic to that thing, that is inside or in or within it, but yet distinct from that thing. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'll be sketching 5 arguments against divine simplicity. The arguments aren't meant to be like decisive demonstrations or like knockdown proofs or anything like that. Instead, I just offer them as reasons that plausibly count, in my mind, against divine simplicity. So let's get on then to my first argument, the providential collapse argument. So under divine simplicity, God is numerically identical to his one absolutely simple act across all possible worlds. That's just a total way reality could be, a possible world. This commitment has formed the basis of a modal collapse objection to classical theism. Now, I'm going to argue that the classical theist's way to avoid modal collapse ends up collapsing, that is, denying or jettisoning divine providence, that is, God's radical control over creation, God's control over 1, whether or not it obtains, and 2, creation's precise content if it does so obtain. So to avoid the modal collapse objection, classical theists have to adopt a kind of radical indeterminism between God and his single intentional act of will on the one hand, and the effect of that act on the other. Given that everything solely about God is fixed across all such worlds, the kind of indeterminism the classical theist must postulate is indeed extremely radical. Even fixing absolutely everything about God, any possible creation whatsoever can come into being. Nothing about God, God's intention, God's act, or God's willing specifies whether or not God's willing is a creative willing. So if God is numerically identical to a single act across all worlds, which is true according to divine simplicity, well, then there's no distinctive willing of this particular creation to obtain, nor is there any distinctive intentional exercise of power to bring creation into being. As philosopher Timothy O'Connor points out, God's willing that this world exist will not be or involve a distinctive intrinsic state of God. That's a quote from Timothy O'Connor. Creation's precise contents, then, seem beyond God's control, since fixing all the facts about God under classical theism leaves open all possible worlds, from worlds in which an infinite multiverse co-obtains with God to worlds in which God exists by himself. Each of them could become actual. God can do nothing distinctive in any such world to ensure any one particular creation obtains. To further support my reasoning here, let's consider an analogy. So suppose that the temperature of a room can be any non-negative number, from 0 to pi to 412.2 to 10 to the power of Google, and so on. Suppose, moreover, that no matter what facts about you obtain, your actions, your intentions, desires, bodily states, and whatnot, no matter what facts about you obtain, none of these facts specify any particular value or even any subset of values among this infinite array of possible temperatures to be actualized. In any situation, everything about you, including your intentions, willings, and actions, leaves perfectly open which of the infinitely many room temperatures becomes actual. I now ask, do you have control over the room's temperature in this situation? I mean, I think that the answer is obviously no, right? No matter what you do, no matter how you move your hands or exert your will and whatnot, the temperature could still be any non-negative number. But then compare this with the classical theistic God. No matter what facts solely about God and what is within God obtain, for example, any desires or intentions or willings or actions and so on, all of which are numerically identical with God, none of these facts specify or determine any particular possible world to obtain, or even any subset of possible worlds among the infinite array of such worlds. Now, before formalizing this argument, I want to define some terms. So by facts about an agent, I mean the facts about how an agent is in themselves. So it includes things like actions, willings, intentions, desires, and so on. By X is perfectly compatible with Y's obtaining, I mean that X leaves open whether Y obtains. Y's obtaining is a live possibility on the supposition that X obtains. And finally, by divine effect, I mean whatever effect of God's one necessary act happens to obtain or come about. So now we can formalize the providential collapse argument as follows. 1, if fixing all the facts about an agent is perfectly compatible with the obtaining of any possible effect among an arbitrarily large range of possible effects, then the agent is not in control of whether a particular effect E obtains among the range of possible effects, right? Like recall the temperature case. Fixing all the facts about you was perfectly compatible with any of those infinitely many values coming to be. And it was precisely because of this that you were not in control of whether some particular temperature comes to be. 2, if divine simplicity is true, then fixing all the facts about God is perfectly compatible with the obtaining of any possible divine effect among an arbitrarily large range of possible divine effects. 3, therefore, if divine simplicity is true, God is not in control of whether a particular divine effect obtains among the arbitrarily large range of possible divine effects. 4, but since God is provident, God is in control of whether a particular divine effect obtains among that range. 5, therefore, divine simplicity is false. So my second argument is called the proposition argument. So propositions are the bearers of truth value, that is either true or false. And they're also what's expressed by declarative sentences. So why think there are propositions in addition to statements like sentence inscriptions and vocal utterances? Well, first, consider the following 2 sentences. Snow is white and Schnee ist weiß. Hopefully I pronounced that right for all you German savants out there. So these are 2 different sentences. But they obviously have something in common, right? Something here is identical in the 2 cases, and that's the proposition expressed. Without propositions, we simply can't make sense of this commonality between them. There's something numerically identical in both of these cases, despite being different sentences. So we need something within our ontology, namely propositions, that can account for that commonality. A second argument for propositions is inspired by philosopher Trenton Merrick's. Consider the syllogism. 1, if there are sentences, then giraffes exist. Conclusion, therefore giraffes exist. Now, surely that argument is invalid, right? The conclusion just doesn't follow from the premise. But if you try to explain validity of arguments in a way that relies just on sentences or other contingent things, then we get a problem. Because then if premise 1 is true and a premise is just a sentence, then it follows that there are sentences, since whatever is true exists, right? Non-existent things, after all, cannot be anything, let alone be true. So again, premise 1 is true only if there are, in fact, sentences. So suppose premise 1 is true. It follows that there are sentences. But then look at premise 1. If there are sentences, then giraffes exist. So it follows that giraffes exist. And therefore, assuming premise 1 is true, the conclusion does, after all, follow. And so the argument turns out to be valid. And that's just obviously wrong. That's a completely wrong result. And so what follows from that by reductio is that we cannot explain validity in a way that relies just on sentences or other contingent things. So we have to treat the premises and conclusions as propositions that exist necessarily and don't just depend on contingent mental activity and aren't just sentences. Here's one further argument, roughly following the one developed by philosopher Josh Rasmussen for the necessary existence of propositions. Consider one such proposition. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. So I take it that this proposition is necessarily true, right? It cannot fail to be true. But if this proposition is necessarily true, well, then it necessarily exists. That's because X is being true presupposes that X exists, right? Non-existent things are precisely nothing. And so they don't have properties like the property of being true. Like they don't even exist in the first place so as to be true or have the property of truth. And since this proposition is true in all possible worlds, and since truth requires existence, it follows that this proposition exists in all possible worlds. But this proposition isn't the only necessary truth. Another necessary truth is, if God exists, then God exists. Per the same reasoning as above, this proposition must necessarily exist because it's necessarily true. Moreover, these two propositions are distinct from one another, right? One is about God, the other isn't. One is a logically necessary truth, true in virtue of its form, while the other is merely a metaphysically necessary truth, truth about the nature of things, like the nature of babies and the nature of torturing, and so on. So we've reasoned to the existence of at least two necessarily existent items: the proposition that torturing babies for fun is wrong, and the proposition that if God exists, then God exists. But as classical theist scholars point out, under divine simplicity in classical theism, anything that is not identical with God, if it is to exist, requires God to create it. But also under classical theism, God is free to create or refrain from creating. Hence, if classical theism is true, anything distinct from God is not necessarily existent. But recall from earlier that we reasoned to the existence of at least two necessarily existent items. And it simply follows from this that there are two distinct items here. It simply follows from there being two distinct items here that at least one of them is distinct from God, right? I mean, if God were identical to both, well, then they would be identical to each other, and which we've seen is false. There are actually two of them. They're not identical to each other. And yet they're both necessarily existent. Hence, there is something distinct from God that is necessarily existent. But since classical theism entails that anything distinct from God is not necessarily existent, it follows that classical theism is false. So let's move on to the third argument, the aloneness argument. I recently published a paper in the journal Religious Studies on this one, so you guys could check that out if you are interested. So remember that according to classical theism, anything distinct from God, if it is to exist, requires God to create it, and God is free to create or refrain from creating. From these, it follows that God could have existed alone, without anything distinct from God. But consider that possible state in which God exists alone. In such a state, God is omniscient, right? So God knows that 1 + 1 = 2, that God freely chose not to create, that he exists alone, and so on. Now, some of these truths or facts are such that God necessarily knows them. For instance, God necessarily knows that 1 + 1 = 2, but some of them are such that God only contingently knows them. For instance, in such a state, God only contingently knows that there are no dogs, that he freely chose not to create, and so on. So some of God's knowledge in such a state is contingent. But now a problem arises, for in such a state, this contingent knowledge is either in God or it's outside of God. But it can't be outside of God in such a state, since there's literally nothing outside of God in such a state, right? Remember, this is a state wherein God is alone. There's nothing outside of God here. So the contingent knowledge must be in God. But that means that there's something that is one, contingent, and two, in God. But that's incompatible with divine simplicity. Remember, all that is in God is identical to God. And God cannot be identical to something contingent, right? God's not a contingent being. And since divine simplicity entails that this knowledge couldn't be in God in such a state, but yet we just reasoned that the knowledge is indeed in God in such a state, it follows that divine simplicity is false. Onward we march to the fourth argument, the changing knowledge argument. So I'll just dive right into the premises. We're going to dive head on. Hopefully we don't make too much of a splash, or hopefully we do actually. So premise one, there is change. The justification for this is that it is manifest and evident to the senses. So many of you will get that reference. Two, if there is change, then some things go from being true to being false, or vice versa. Why? Well, just think about it, right? If there's change, for example, water's going from a liquid state to a solid state, then that the water is liquid goes from being true to being false. And that the water is solid goes from being false to being true. Premise 3, if some things go from being true to being false, then God goes from knowing them to not knowing them. This follows from the factivity of knowledge. Knowledge is factive. In other words, one can only know that P is true if P is in fact true. It cannot be the case that one knows P, but P is false. So for example, it's true that Pints with Aquinas is awesome, and so it makes no sense to say that I know Pints with Aquinas is not awesome, right? Likewise, it doesn't make sense to say I know 1 + 1 = 3. No, that's false. That's just ludicrous. So this entails that if P genuinely goes from being true to being false, then it can't remain the case that one knows P. For if it remained the case that one knows P, well then since knowing P presupposes P's truth, it would follow that P itself remained true. But ex hypothesi, P went from being true to being false, and hence didn't remain true. Thus, if some things go from being true to being false, then God goes from knowing them to not knowing them. Now, as an aside, in the case at hand, right, God would go from knowing P to knowing the negation of P because he's omniscient. I'm not saying there are truths God doesn't know. Okay, so do not misrepresent me, my peeps. Okay, so 4, this is premise 4. If God goes from knowing them to not knowing them, then there is succession in God's life, and moreover, God has potential, namely potential to acquire knowledge. So this is just what succession means, to go from one thing to another, or one way to another. It's just also what potential means, right? God has the potential here to acquire knowledge. 5, if there is succession in God's life, and moreover, if God is potential, then God is not simple. This is because succession implies successive distinct states or stages, and such distinct stages are incompatible with simplicity. Moreover, if God is potential, then he is, at least according to classical theism, a composite of act and potency, and therefore not simple. Conclusion 6, so God is not simple. Now, note that nothing I've said here presupposes that God's knowledge is non-causal, or that God's knowledge is passive, or that God's knowledge is causally or otherwise dependent upon creatures. My argument is perfectly compatible with the direction of explanation being from God's knowledge to creatures. My argument is only based on 1, the reality of change, 2, the fact that change entails that some things change truth value, and 3, the factivity of knowledge. And finally, my 5th argument, the explanatory difference argument. So this argument employs the following explanatory difference principle, or EDP for short, where an explanandum is the thing to be explained, and the explanans is the thing doing the explaining. So here's what the EDP says. A difference in the explanandum presupposes a difference in explanatorily efficacious factors in the total explanans. So I know that's a bit complicated. We're going to have to get some examples here. So suppose I'm choosing between chocolate and vanilla ice cream. Now, I like to work out and try to keep my weight down, so maybe I should choose chocolate vanilla protein bars. But, I wasn't thinking of that when I wrote the script. So we're going to stick with ice cream. So you're just going to have to deal with it. Suppose I end up choosing chocolate. Why? Why do I choose chocolate? What explains that? Well, the explanation will presumably be something like, 1, I desired chocolate ice cream. 2, the means to fulfill my desire was within my actualizing power. 3, I have some good reasons to eat chocolate ice cream. 4, I don't have stronger countervailing desires, reasons not to eat chocolate ice cream, and so on. These are all the elements or factors or features within the explanans that are explanatorily efficacious with respect to the explanandum. They do the explanatory heavy lifting, as it were. Like they are efficacious in explaining the explanandum. They enter into the explanation. So with that illustration out of the way, we can now ask, why believe EDP is true? Why think that differences in explananda presuppose differences in explanantia? That's the plural form of explanans. I had to look that up, so you guys should be proud of me. Here are 5 reasons to think that EDP is true. So first, it just seems intuitive. I mean, like, suppose you work in the red division of the Play-Doh factory and have only ever seen the machines just pump out red Play-Doh. But one day, blue Play-Doh is pumped out, and so you and your coworkers are like freaking out. You're like calling the division manager, and you're just you're breaking your nails. Everything is going wrong. So you naturally intuit here that there must have been something different in the explanatory factors that produced the blue Play-Doh. Perhaps the input materials were different or whatever. Like you wouldn't think, I guess all the explanatory factors were the same. No, that difference in the explanandum, it calls out for some difference in the explanans, like different input materials. So that's the first reason. It just seems intuitive. The second reason is that our universal experience of different explananda attests to their total explanantia being different. We have strong inductive evidential support for it, that is. Third, abduction. The EDP seems to be the best explanation for why there is such universal experiential support in the first place, right? It's a simple principle with both explanatory breadth and depth. If EDP were false, why don't we, for instance, experience all around us a kind of chaos wherein wildly different effects or explananda obtain from the same ordinary causes and explanations with which we're familiar? The hypothesis that such wild chaos is simply impossible best explains, I say, why we never see it obtain in actuality. Fourth, explicability. If the total explanations in two cases are utterly and completely qualitatively identical, well, then there could be no ground or reason as to why the explananda differ. The difference in the explananda would be an inexplicable brute occurrence, and all else being equal, we should minimize inexplicability and bruteness. Fifth, if EDP is false, it's unclear how we can avoid inductive skepticism. The inductive skeptic claims, for instance, that I don't know that a stone dropped from my waist tomorrow will fall. With EDP in hand, however, we can resist this claim. For the stones failing to fall tomorrow would constitute a difference in the explanandum. But in order for such a difference to obtain, there would have to be, per EDP, some difference in the total explanans. And thus, if we're rationally justified in holding that the total explanans obtains and is utterly identical in both cases, well, then we're actually rationally justified in holding that the explanandum, namely the stones falling, will actually persist in accordance with the thus far established regularity. But if EDP is false, then it seems genuinely possible, despite having identical explanans, that the explanandum will differ in the unexamined cases. Now, I know I'm at 18 minutes, but I just
wrap
got
up your thought
30
there.
seconds left. Okay, so I submit then that we at least have reason to accept EDP, but if EDP is true, then divine simplicity is false, because according to divine simplicity, there's no difference in the explanans, namely God, across worlds, that accounts for differences in the explanandum, namely creation. By contrast, non-classical theistic models of God can explain cross-world differences in creation in terms of distinct freely willed actions, which are in turn explained by a multiplicity of reasons in divine mental states like desires and plans that factor differentially into the explanans. So I conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was excellent. Okay, everybody watching, usually in a standard debate, we'll have opening statements, then we'll have rebuttals, then second rebuttals. And the advantage of doing a debate like that, of course, is that it gives each debater time to respond to the arguments that were made in the opening statement. We've decided not to do that today. Instead, we wanted to have more of a discussion. And so I know both Father Pine and Joe brought up arguments in their opening statements. I'm not sure in this sort of format if we're going to be able to get to every one, but that's up to you guys. We're going to take 45 minutes for you both to chat back and forth. I was saying we had Matt Dillahunty on the other day, and I actually really enjoyed him myself, but it got intense at certain times. I know it probably won't be like that for y'all too. It'll be a lovely chat. And after that, we'll take some Q&A. All right, so I'm going to let you guys go for it, because you're both, as they say in Australia, old enough and ugly enough to figure this out on your own. Go for it.
I'll let you start.
Perfect. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we can just take your 5 arguments and maybe I can give some kind of like background, as it were, or maybe see if I can clarify the divine attributes that are at stake as a way by which maybe to kind of situate it in a better light according to a classical theist conception. And then we can just chat back and forth and try. Well, yeah, we can try to get to them, because I think that like a lot of the stuff that I advanced was just stage setting. So they're not. I didn't rehearse arguments with the same rigor that you did. So maybe we just stick with yours. But if there's stuff about what I said,
I have some things I'd like to touch on. But yeah, I'm cool with the main kind of outline of your plan.
Perf. So yeah, I guess maybe just some backgrounding. So pertinent thoughts that might help better situate in a classical theist way all of your arguments would be so just following St. Thomas's exposition after he goes through questions 3 through 11, stating some of these divine attributes. He then takes this like deep breath and he talks about how we can know and name God. And in there, I think there are just some helpful cautions when it comes to thinking about God, also predicating things of God. So maybe just, I'll just talk for like 3 to 4 minutes, and then we can go into explanatory difference arguments and maybe just work our way from the back to the front. Okay, so I guess like some conceptual cautions regarding predication. So predication is based on knowledge, and then we have to confront the fact of divine transcendence. So St. Thomas, right, he doesn't just say that everything collapsed into a kind of contentless apophaticism, but he does acknowledge a big ontological gap between us and God, which certainly problematizes quantitative knowledge of God. And I think that what he's basing this off is the idea of there being a kind of inadequacy of the effect with respect to the cause. So, on on a kind of Augustinian or Tomistic understanding of the divine ideas, created things are limited or imperfect, understood in a certain way, participations in the divine life or in the divine being. And as a result of which, when you argue from something that by comparison is less so to its cause, you're gonna lose some things. So St. Thomas will say things like God is noble in himself, but not necessarily knowable quod nos with respect to this kind of natural theology that we're undertaking. God himself is supremely knowable, infinitely knowable, but by comparison to the overabundant divine light, St. Thomas likens us to kind of like bats or owls, as it were, at midday. Like our faculties are not sufficient to kind of draw it all in and make complete sense of it. So I think that certainly, I know the classical theists have been accused of kind of getting mysterious when things get tough. So I just want to say that at the outset, not as a way by which to say, and now from this point on, I will think and argue irresponsibly, but just to say that there are certain things which make this conversation difficult. I mean, theological parenthesis. I think this is one of the beautiful things about the dispensation of the incarnation, which is referred to in the Greek. Well, it's referred to in the tradition often as a kind of condescension, right? That God limits himself so as to be more readily assimilated or taken in. And one of those images with respect to the scriptures is that God abbreviates the word, which I don't know. I just find that really beautiful. Okay. So what then of our predication? I think that with a couple of these arguments, I think that we need to do a kind of conceptual therapy when it comes to the thing signified and then the mode of signifying. So in the way that we make arguments, we're going to come across the fact of our having encountered these things in imperfect instantiations, and then just doing our best not to import that imperfection into our predications of God. There's also the problem too of concretion and abstraction. We make distinctions between man and humanity, whereas those types of distinctions don't really obtain when we're talking about a God who is his divinity. And even like with our speech, we have problems of composition. So when we talk about it in propositional terms, you've got subject, verb, or copula, and then you got your complement or predicate. And so we're in the custom of when we attribute things, we think of it in these compository terms, or such as the nature of a discursive or ratio native intellect. Whereas we want to, remove that from God, remove anything that smacks of time-boundedness or discursion or things of that sort. And then just kind of run this through St. Thomas's understanding of analogy, part of which he derives from Pseudo-Dionysius, this idea of, we follow the way of causality. When we encounter something in this world, we can genuinely say that, what of it is perfect is a participation in God's perfection. So we can attribute there some similitude, as it were. But then we have to remote what of it is imperfect. So our goodness is like God's goodness, but it in no way is God's goodness limited or imperfect in the way that ours is. And then this last kind of third and final move, the via eminentiae, which is to say that God's goodness is supereminent, right? So it transcends our goodness. And again, that's not just a mystery claim. It's to say that sometimes we get peaks behind the veil, but we're going to have to bow before the fact of its transcending our mind, it being partly alike and partly different, and that being that. So those are just some clarifications. I hope that I stayed to my stated time. But then with respect to the arguments themselves, maybe you just, I've talked, so maybe you just choose arguments that you think would best benefit from interrogation.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, I've got 5 fingers, so let's do number 3. I don't even remember which one was the third one. So let me go over and click. That one might have been.
Third is, I have it as aloneness.
Okay, yeah, let's go with that one. So I'll turn over to you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's, I read your paper, so thanks for writing it. And thanks for the thought that it provokes, certainly. Insofar as it advances the discussion, it's a service. So I guess I have certain hesitations, or there are certain things about it that make me nervous or make me worry. So yeah, a couple of points. I'll just cruise through them, and then you just tear them to pieces. So I think that just in general, it has a somewhat anthropomorphic character in that it seems at times to talk about God, to describe God as if he were time bound. And so I think that you can kind of advance a helpful eternity clarification to that point. So sometimes when people describe eternity, they describe what St. Thomas would understand more properly as sempiternity, endless duration in either direction. Whereas St. Thomas, with respect to eternity, is more indebted to this idea proposed by Boethius, Saint Severinus Boethius, what's up, who says that eternity is the whole and simultaneous possession of endless life. So to think about it is the sense that, so God exhausts all that there is of being. Another way by which to say is that God, holds all together of being in one simultaneous embrace of his own subsisting being or his own subsisting essence. And in that, all things are present to him, right? All things are present to him in this one hic et nunc. So time, right? So the stuff. Aristotle will argue that time is a measure of motion. So I mapped out those different kinds of motion with respect to quantity, quality, and place. And so whenever you have change, you have some measure whereby that change is registered, and that being time. So God's eternity follows from his immutability. So on account of the fact that he doesn't change, he is eternal. So we possess our lives from moment to moment, as it were, and the past slips away from us, and the future has not yet come into our possession, whereas God possesses it all in one whole and simultaneous embrace. And I think that that's just good stage setting as a background for the argument. And then with respect to aloneness, I think here a helpful clarification is brought forward by Father Robert Sokolowski in his book, The God of Faith and Reason, where he talks about the Christian distinction, it's short. It's a short book, and it's beautifully written. And he talks about how God plus creation is not greater than God. And on a certain conception, that sounds like pantheist or panentheist. But what he's saying there is that because God is ipsum esse per se subsistens, everything else kind of only has esse, as it were, by participated fashion. So God doesn't exist with creatures in the way in which some of the alone characterizations seem to portray. And with that, comes this kind of clarification about creation, namely that creation isn't so much like a beginning of time, as it were, but creation as a relation of dependence, specifically a mixed relation. So creatures are related to God, but God is not related to creatures in St. Thomas's understanding. And he makes that point really excellently with respect to the incarnation, because, creation gets wild when you start talking about the hypostatic union. And how is one, describe a divine person assuming a human nature and not changing as a result? It's like, okay, let's go. So St. Thomas, in driving home this point, he'll say things like, we can't prove philosophically that creation has a beginning, but this idea of a relation of dependence still obtains regardless of whether or not, because it's about this fact of participated esse. So there's a lot of, we can only ever designate God from our vantage, but when we do so, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're importing some of the mixedness of the relation and attributing it back to God. So those would be backdropping. And then I think for me, the central claim in reading your paper, it's with the fifth proposition of your argument that I would advance a claim against. So specifically with respect to this idea about knowledge, insofar as God, and all these things, and you advance it in one of your arguments that God doesn't know things from things, and the directionality of truth vis-a-vis God is from God to the things. So I think that with respect to this particular knowledge claim, God doesn't abstract intelligible species from things. So he knows himself, and he knows his power, and he knows everything that can possibly be subject to his power, and that he can have unchanging knowledge of changeable things, or God can know contingent things necessarily. So with respect to that, God being alone, and then there being some contingent thing which would have to be posited as an intrinsic accident of God. I don't think that so God's knowledge of contingent things doesn't entail any contingency as God is the claim that I would make, sed contra, because of the peculiar nature of God's knowledge. And then with that, St. Thomas characterizes God's will by saying that God wills necessary things necessarily, but he wills contingent things to transpire contingently. And he thinks that that's entailed by the kind of causal potency, as it were. I am going to stop there.
Okay. Yeah, no, sounds good. So there were the four initial, so I'm going to mark off the points. I had 6 points that I will address. 4 initial ones that were kind of stage setting, and then the 2 which were somewhat more critical of one particular step in the argument. So with regard to the first point about time-boundedness and a clarification on eternity and all things being present to him. So I'm not quite sure I see how this would track with the aloneness argument in particular. I mean, if anything, we talk more about world-boundedness and not time-boundedness, God's being within worlds. Now, I have had some people pose reservations to me about talking about modal world semantics and mixing that with classical theism and whatnot. But we were pretty explicit. Well, we tried to circumvent that worry in one of our footnotes, where we talked about how, listen, we don't need to quantify over possible worlds. We can solely talk in terms of possibility and necessity operators, which that's how we articulated our argument, like the syllogistic form of the argument. So if you look at the syllogistic form of the argument, of course, there's no talk of possible worlds or anything. We don't need to assume some kind of possible worlds ontology or whatnot. As we use it in the paper, it's a useful heuristic. So I think that's what I'd say in response to the first one. I don't really see it as being time-bound, but instead as being world-bound. And secondly, I see that as any detraction from the argument's force or what have you, because we're using it as a useful heuristic, and all talks of possible worlds can be translated into Thomist-friendly terms, say. So that's the first thing that I would say in response to that. Now let's move on to the second point, where you mentioned Sokolowski and God and creation is not greater than God, and there's a sense in which God doesn't exist with creatures. So I also had someone raise this point to me, and I don't think that the argument assumes that like God in some sense exists with creatures, or that God plus creation is greater than God. So when we say God exists with creatures and without creatures, all we mean is not that there is some real relation that God stands in, like this relation of existing alongside creatures or something like that. We just mean the following conjunction: God exists, and there does not exist an X such that X is distinct from God. So that's all that we mean. That doesn't assume that there are any real relations of God. It doesn't assume that God plus creation is greater than God being alone, and so on. So our use of with and with creatures does not impute anything that the classical theist would reject or the Thomist would reject from the get-go. So I think I don't see any detraction from the argument on that score. And then finally, for the preliminaries, creation has a mixed relation. I kind of addressed that there. I don't really see it as I don't see anything in the argument as faltering on that. Because again, we're not assuming when we say God exists in some worlds with creatures and in other worlds not with creatures. We're not saying that God bears some relation to creatures in one world and not in others. We just mean in some worlds there are creatures and in others there aren't. And in those that there aren't, we can call that an alone world, which is such that God doesn't exist along, like, with the creatures. And by that, again, we just mean that conjunction. So we can eliminate any intimation of imputing relations to God that he bears to creatures. So I think I have addressed those 4 initial points, and now I'll move on to the next 2 points. So the first point that you made was God knows his power perfectly, and in so doing, he knows that to which his power extends. So we did talk about this in the paper, and I think there are 2 things that I'd want to say in response. So the first thing that I want to say in response is God knowing his power. It seems to me, let's take a step back. Think about that thought experiment in the philosophy of mind debate. And it's Mary's room, right? So Mary's in her room. She's a colorblind scientist. All she's seen her entire life is, gray and black and white. Let's say her skin is painted white and whatnot. But nevertheless, she learns everything you can possibly know about the neurophysiology of vision. So like she has read all the scientific books. Like this is a mature neuroscience. She's read all these neuroscientific facts about the photons hitting the retinas and all the patterns of neural stimulation and all that, fun stuff. Yet still, there's still something we intuitively think that she doesn't know, and that she can't know merely from gleaning those kind of objective third-person facts, namely what it is like to experience color, say. Like when she's released from the room and she sees a red apple for the first time, she surely learns something. And no amount of studying or gleaning the physical, objective, third-person facts will bestow her or grant her knowledge of these first-person, subjective, experiential facts. So that sounds like a completely diversion from what we were talking about, but it's actually not. So when we consider when God consults his own essence, say, or his own power, which are the same thing, really, God is only consulting, as it were, necessary things. He's only consulting necessary truths, ways that his being can be participated in, ways that creatures can imitate him, or ways that he is imitable. But that's a separate point from ways that he is in fact contingently imitated, or he is how they in fact participate in him. And I would venture that just as no amount of studying the third person objective facts can give you any knowledge of the subjective realm, no amount of solely studying or consulting necessary facts, if you give someone a list of necessary truths, none of that will allow you to gain knowledge of something that is contingently the case. So if God is just consulting, in this case, the story, how he gains contingent knowledge, say, if he's consulting his essence and the necessary truths, that's just categorically insufficient, so it seems, for gleaning or getting a hold of the contingent truths. Because again, he's only consulting something that's metaphysically necessary. And so you're still left with this complete mystery as to how you get the knowledge of the contingents. So that's the first response that I make to that. The second response that I make to that is that we make this in the paper, is that this is only telling us how God comes to know the contingent things. It doesn't remove the fact that something is still contingent here, right? God still only contingently knows that he is alone. In worlds in which God exists with us, God doesn't know that because he isn't alone, and knowledge is factive. And so it is in fact contingently the case in the alone world that God knows that he is alone. And so given this like contingently obtaining fact, that's what we mean when we're focusing on the contingent knowledge. And so God's knowledge in this case wouldn't be necessary. It would indeed be contingent, because in some worlds he has it, in other worlds he doesn't. So precisely because in some worlds he's alone, in other worlds he's not. So I think that those two responses, in my mind, sufficiently rebut that point. And then that also goes to the point where you said God's knowledge of contingents doesn't entail contingency in God. I think that kind of goes against the factivity of knowledge, right? So that's the second rejoinder that I was just making, that knowledge is factive in the sense that one can only know P if P is indeed true. But if P is contingently true, it's such that it's true in some worlds and false in others. Well, God can't know that in every world because it's literally false in some worlds. And so in that case, God's knowledge of P would indeed be contingent, so it seems. So that's what I'd say on behalf of the aloneness argument there.
Proposal. Maybe I could just have like 2 minutes on this, and then if you want to launch an argument against something that I said, and then I can respond, and then you can kind of wrap that up. We can do ABA, BAB.
Yeah, so you can have the last word on this. I'm perfectly cool with that. And then we can move on to my criticizing one of your things. So I'm cool with that.
Perfect. All right. So I guess just to take your points in order, I think that eternity matters more when it's seen in a causal setting. So in the sense that whenever you introduce considerations of contingency, you're introducing considerations of change, because that's like the language of the third way is, with respect to contingent things, there would be a time at which none were. And people hear that and they're like, wait, what does that mean? He's just talking about in the sense that they could not have been, as a result of which we need an explanation as to why they are. And then when you talk about change, you're talking about motion and you're talking about time. And I think that eternity gives us a way by which to describe how God embraces that time in such a way as to, hold it all together in himself and to pre-contain it in its causal source in such a way that for God, there are no surprises, in the sense that, all of those things, as it were, all of those times, all of the situatedness of those things and times is present to God in one eternal now, because he's their causal source. And as their causal source, who gives to them being and agency and the concursus of being and agency, he holds all those things together in himself and is present to them most intimately. So I think that as a result of which I think that matters. And so it's for that reason that you can advance arguments to the effect of like change in creatures does not necessarily, it doesn't entail change in God. Insofar as like a playwright, could write a play, and in that play, it might be one of my favorite, 10th grade vocab words. It might be Bildungsroman. It might project the maturation of its protagonist, and the playwright has foreseen that there will be change in the actor, but he's kind of giving being, as it were, to the entire dispensation of that play. He's animating it, and as it's realized, it is, as it were, all present to him. Like, he's not surprised by it, but there is still a real place for the causal agency of those actors who find themselves situated in it. Obviously, all analogies limp, and it has to be purified of imperfections, but I think that gives some indication as to why. And then with respect to the Mary in her room, I love philosophy of mind thought experiments, by the way, are such a wild genre. They're like, okay, let's take something that is abundantly obvious to our intuitions. You're wearing one pink sock and a yellow glove. You're on Mars, and evidently you're underwater. It's like, oh my gosh, you guys are crazy. So Mary's in her room. She's a colorblind scientist. She knows what it's like, by her intellectual knowing, as it were, but she doesn't yet know by experience. So I think that with respect to, like the application of this type of characterization to God, what we're talking about here more in St. Thomas's understanding is the logic or the argumentation of the fourth way, which for him is a matter of primacy and perfection. So the way that he runs Maxime Tale, it's like, okay, you've got things that are this good and things that are that good and things that are so much more good, but their very intelligibility is pre-contained in God as the principle of primacy and perfection, as their causal source from which they derive their being and their intelligibility, insofar as the two are just convertible. So I think with respect to contingency, God isn't surprised by contingency, because contingency is just a pale shadow of necessity, right? So it's a form of being that is kind of weaker, as it were, less expressed, less pronounced. And that's to come at it from like a kind of top-down metaphysical way, than coming at it from a more propositional or logical way. So I think that would be a response ad mentem divi tome. Yeah, I guess. And then with respect to the last thing, the last distinct thing as I registered it. So when you say that this is just a matter of telling how God comes to know contingent things, and then, like that it doesn't lean too terribly much on the fact of aloneness. I agree insofar as I don't think that it leans too terribly much on the fact of aloneness, and you set it up as an exhaustive dialectic so as to show, like, regardless of how you cut it, you're going to end up having problems. But again, I think it's just this idea with respect to like God's knowing of contingency. It eventually is rooted back in the consideration of, like how does God's knowledge work? So we talk about, knowledge is, like the registering of a truth, as it were, or it's the kind of cognition of a thing in an intellectual mode. So truth being the adequation of thing and intellect. In our case, right, we abstract species from the things, we encounter them, and as a result of which we would describe our knowledge as a learning of a sort, or maybe as a doctrine if we're taught. But with respect to God, the order of intellect and thing is reversed. So God's knowledge being a causally potent knowledge, and it's not that God learns from reality, but that he imparts to reality whatever form of being it exhibits, whether that be necessary or contingent. And St. Thomas even affords for the idea that there could be necessary things that have a kind of participated necessity. So for him, it's not so much to be distinguished between contingency and necessity as it is to be distinguished between participated and unparticipated being. I will stop talking.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay, so with regard to what you said, so I take it that one dialectical avenue I can approach in responding to that I can take in responding to the arguments that you gave is to show how they don't distinctively support divine simplicity as opposed to other models of God on which divine simplicity is false. So I'll just call such other models of God non-classical theisms. They can affirm timelessness. They can affirm other sorts of things. They might affirm divine temporality. We're just going to set those aside. All I'm going to say is these views see God as the ultimate foundation of reality, who creates and sustains things apart from himself. He exists necessarily. He's absolutely perfect, but he's not simple. That's the only thing that's what I'm going to mean by non-classical theism. So with that clarification out of the way of what I mean by non-classical theism, I would argue that the arguments that you proffer don't distinctively support classical theism as opposed to non-classical theism, or divine simplicity as opposed to models of God on which God isn't simple. So for instance, the first way, I think that non-classical theists can perfectly well accept that chains of change, subordinated per se, must be finite. They must have a fundamental member. Change requires a changer. And they're ultimately going to trace this back to the non-classical theistic God, who is not simple, but is nevertheless the first mover. So you can have a first mover without classical theism. So I think that that's my response to the first argument. The second one, I think you can have an uncaused cause without going to classical theism. So I don't think that that supports divine simplicity, which is, of course, the point under contention for our debate. The third thing is a kind of argument from contingency. Once again, non-classical theistic models of God are going to view God as necessarily existent. He's the necessarily existent foundation of all reality, and he is the ultimate explanation for contingent things. But yet, that's not getting you to divine simplicity or classical theism. And so they can accept that we need some ultimate account for contingency, and they're going to locate that ultimate account in terms of the necessarily existent transcendent perfect being of God. It's just a non-classical theistic God. So I don't think that the third argument distinctively supports classical theism. And then with respect to the henological argument, they could probably say that the distinct gradations of perfections of things are indeed, in some sense, imitations of God's perfection. But perhaps these are just distinct properties that God has, say, which they are all, imitating, and God is the ultimate explanation for them. So we do indeed have that the thing in which they are imitating is both the causal source of them and that he is what they imitate. So I think that non-classical theistic models of God once again can subvert this argument for classical theism in particular. And then one final thing that I'll say is this is where you would probably push back and respond. It's like, well, this God, this non-classical theistic God's essence would be distinct from its existence. And so there must either be an internal cause or principle from which it proceeds, the existence that is, or there must be an exterior principle or cause from which it proceeds or from which it comes that explains it. And I think that the non-classical theist is just going to say, no, like God is ultimate, God is perfect, God is necessarily existent. You don't have to have some kind of extrinsic source or cause merely from the fact that his essence is numerically distinct from his existence or what have you. They would reject that claim and say it's a false dichotomy. They would say, yeah, okay, if something's essence is distinct from its existence, then either the existence is caused from an interior principle, an exterior principle, or it's uncaused. And they're gonna look at their ontology and say, what do we have that could serve that role as the uncaused thing? It's the necessarily existent foundation of reality that is a perfect being that causes all other contingent things. So their essence and existence are contingently combined. They are contingent composites. And it's that contingency of the composition of essence and existence that requires explanation. When you have this necessary foundation of reality, which is a perfect being, the essence and existence aren't contingently linked. It's not as though they happen to obtain. They're necessarily existent, necessarily combined, as it were. And so I think that non-classical theists can avoid every single one of these arguments such that none of them distinctively support classical theism. So that's my main response.
Nice. Okay. So this is a suggestion for going forward. You propose these all suppositionally on account of the fact that you are not a non-classical theist. But I suspect that you have more or less sympathy with them. You probably think like, yeah, some of these arguments are cool, some of these arguments stink, but you're proposing them in a way so as to be dialectically responsible and just give talk for each one. Would you mind picking one or two that you think are good arguments? So like just spell it out a little bit more, because what you supplied are good for heuristic purposes, but I might just end up restating what I had already said and you'll be like, yeah, blather. So you maybe just pick one or two that you think is a good, like an argument with which you sympathize in a more than suppositional way, and then I can respond to that.
I'll pick one that I find the most fun to think about. So that's the first way. So the argument from change, right? So roughly there is change. Change is the actualization of potential. There are chains of changes that are subordinated per se. Chains that are subordinated per se cannot regress infinitely. I know I pointed that way. I should probably point like downward because it's a chain of fundamentality. So they cannot regress infinitely. Therefore, there is at least one unmoved mover, unchanged changer. So what the non-classical theist is going to say is, there's a non sequitur here from unmoved mover to unmovable in all respect whatsoever mover. So they're going to say, no, this doesn't get you a wholly or purely actual being. This being could have some potencies, which say right here and right now are not in fact being actualized, or which are not required to be actualized in order for this being to serve as the terminus of the per se chains of change in question. So this is a point made by a philosopher, Scott MacDonald, in his excellent paper, Aquinas' Parasitic Cosmological Argument, where he goes on the first way. He points out that there's this pretty big gap between, in fact, unmoved mover of chains of per se changes versus an utterly immovable, utterly unmovable, unchangeable in all respects whatsoever, which Scott MacDonald forcefully argues is not what is given to you by the first way. You have to adduce, so Scott MacDonald argues, and I find it quite convincing, you have to adduce like the de ante argument, such that the first way becomes parasitic upon that argument. Now, I know some people have metaphysical interpretations of the first way on which it's basically identical to the de ante, but I'm focusing on the more change-focused, or the change-based argument from the first way as you kind of presented it here. So long story short, I would say that they can accept all the premises and that there is in fact an unmoved mover, but it's just not unmovable in all respects whatsoever. Perhaps this being can initiate certain changes within itself or account for some other changes that aren't related to the explanatory lacuna that it fills with respect to the changes that are occurring in creation. So that's what I would say in response to the first way.
All right, sweet. I'm thinking about this for the first time, so this might be a little bit of a goat rodeo. So these are some thoughts, these are some suggestions. Exactly. Imagine that, and then picture what's about to happen.
Wait, are they on Mars? Are they like underwater? The goats?
Exactly. Like, no, yep. They're wearing scuba gear.
I think it was a pink sock,
and it's evident
too.
So this is just kind of sussing it out. What might other people have already said, or what might one say in response? I think that there are certain things in the argument which account for it, maybe not explicitly stated, but the logic can be extended to encompass some of these worries or some of these concerns. So St. Thomas obviously he's heavily relying on the argument as it's advanced in Physics 7 and Physics 8. And he takes issue with some of the moves that Aristotle makes, like the famous one about it's necessarily, creation is, well, Aristotle wouldn't say creation. The world is eternal because every now is a meeting of past and future. He's like, whoa, Chief just question beg.
Yeah.
Right. So with respect to Book 7, the big thing there that he proves is omne quod movetur obalio movetur. So everything that is moved by another. And so I think that if you end up with a God who is himself moved in some way, shape, or form, then you have to account for it's being moved, and by what or by whom. And I think that the fear that you have there is a kind of unintelligible circle of causality, because I think that the vision that St. Thomas projects of creation is of all things hanging from one fixed point, right? Because you could imagine a system in which things caused each other under different respects. And certainly St. Thomas anticipates that as a possibility and account for it. It's like something can cause another thing by formal causality, whereas A can cause B by formal causality and B can cause A by efficient causality, like St. Thomas describes the interaction of intellect and will, for instance. But I think that if you don't have an ultimate causal ground, then all of these, per se ordered dependent series of causes effectively crumble and the causality of them ceases to obtain. So the question would be, if God has some potency to be realized, or if God is moved in some way, then from where? From below, from a kind of place of parity, or from above? And then what are we attributing to that being? Are we saying that like God is wholly actual, but for the fact that he has a real sweet tooth, so he's always looking for opportunities, to get like ice cream or to get Sour Patch Kids, blah blah blah.
Protein bars.
It's like, yeah, exactly. So then God is somehow dependent on the purveyor of ice cream, Sour Patch Kids, and protein bars. But who is this purveyor? Show me this purveyor. Say more about this purveyor. And I think those are the types of worries that make this a little bit, that ultimately make it incoherent, as the way that St. Thomas, on the terms that St. Thomas has projected it. And I think too, when you think about this from another vantage, what we're talking about with God here is he's able to actualize all potencies. So a thing can't both be in potency and cause potency in the same kind of in the same way or under the same respect, which means that God has to be actual with respect to all potencies to be actualized or to be realized if he is going to serve as the ultimate causal ground whereby those changes take place, or whereby the series of causes that effectuate those changes are intelligible and obtained. So there it's like a matter of primacy or perfection, that you can't give what you don't have, and that if it's in the effect, it must be pre-contained either, in one way or the other, virtually or eminently in its causal source. So I think that it's there that St. Thomas says it has to be pre-contained and it has to be actualized if it is to bring it about, if it is to be the source thereof. So those would be some initial moves.
Yeah. So I think the main thing that you're asking there is this problem, like, well, if God is changeable, right, then if we're focusing on the possible worlds, say, where that change is actualized, well, what causes that, right? Like if it's something in creation, well, then it seems as though we have a kind of bootstrapping problem, because God is supposed to be the non-classical theist. In my response is granting that God is the source of change in the created order. And so if God is the source of that, but yet somehow God changes and those have to like circle back around and change God in some way, then you have some kind of circular dependence, such that God is accounting for their changes, but yet they are in some sense accounting for God's change. So I think that that's the worry you're spelling out. Now, one thing that the non-classical theist could say is God is the cause of God's own potential reducing from potential to actual, or perhaps some other actual aspect of God causes it. So, for instance, we know that wholes, of course. So you know this when Aquinas says that whatever is changed by another, right? Ed Feser, for instance, is super adamant that like Aquinas does not mean that there's this entire separate being in every single case, which is such that when something moves, there's this other being that moves that. Like, no, because that would be absurd. Like, we know that there are certain internal causes and whatnot, such that one part of me or one aspect of me can actualize that other aspect of me. And that's still being moved by another, because the potential is numerically distinct from the actual thing which is causing that reduction of potency to act. And so you maintain that principle, but you don't have to adduce some kind of entirely separate being which is causing that. So in that case, sometimes the actual aspects of a thing can actualize or account for or explain the other potential aspects of a thing which reduce from potency to act. And so in the case of God, it doesn't make God dependent on creation in any way, shape, or form, because either God as a whole supposit or whole substance could be the actualizing cause of those certain changes within God, or some other actual aspect of God could be. So for instance, perhaps God has certain reasons and desires, which are divine psychological states across different possible worlds. And in some of those give rise to different actions of God's. And so in this case, we have an explanatory relation, but it's within God, right? Certain more fundamental aspects of God are explaining less fundamental aspects that are, the changes that are occurring. And my point here is just that we no longer have this circularity worry of God's explaining creation. Creation is somehow going back to explain God or what have you. We preserve the principle that every change requires a cause that's distinct from it. We don't have divine simplicity. We don't have classical theism. I really think that the non-classical theist has ample resources to avoid the purely actual God conclusion that I think is not supported by the first way. So I know we're at 38 minutes, or it's actually 39 now. Maybe we could just touch on one more argument of mine, and then we could just do pretty short, and then we can hear what you say, Father Pine, in response to that, maybe.
Your thoughts, Matt?
Oh, well, we do have about 5 minutes. What I thought would have been cool, or maybe might be cool now, is if you might maybe ask questions of each other to perhaps better try and understand where each one's coming from. Somebody just said in the chat, and this was just hilarious, they said, "Why do I feel like I'm watching religious mathematics?" I think that was good. And, we can take as long as we want before we go to questions, but I thought it might be cool if... I don't know. Is there questions you guys want to ask of each other and trying to kind of get to the heart of what the other's arguing or not arguing? Or I know we didn't necessarily plan for that, so I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
No, that's cool. Okay, 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Father Pine, who's your favorite saint and why?
Nice. You're going to be blown away by this. My favorite saint is the Blessed Mother. Saint Thomas has this beautiful description when he talks about the irradiation of holiness he says, like, picture you build a great bonfire and you know, you invite all your friends. That thing's going to radiate heat, but the closer you are to that heat, the more that you're going to soak it up. You know, the hotter you'll end up. And when he describes the grace of divine maternity, according to the Blessed Virgin Mary, he says there's just no closer way, you know, to the incarnation. As a result of which, she is toasty. She is just living close to that bonfire, as Garth Brooks once sang in different words. Yeah. I have a question for you to follow on.
Okay.
So I've noticed that you have, like, formally, you're very capable at argumentation. But my question is, what do you think? Because I know that you're good at the formal art of sussing out arguments and advancing them for the purpose of, you know, dialectical rigor. But I sometimes wonder, like, what epistemologically, and, you know, you can, it's your prerogative to bracket it, but epistemologically, I suspect that you think, you know, some of these are better arguments, and I think that you think that some of them are more or less veridical. So you bracketed the question at the outset, but I'd be interested in just a couple minutes on, like, what do you think?
About what? Of which aspect? Like some of the arguments, or okay? So, uh, I find non-classical theistic models of God more plausible to my mind than classical theism. To be sure, I have abundant respect for classical theism. I think its intellectual tradition is wonderful. I really enjoy reading classical theist scholars and whatnot. I think it's super duper fun, and yeah, it's been really rewarding studying it pretty at depth. But I myself would be more attracted to, if I were, doxastically speaking, if I were a theist, I'd probably take a view where either maybe somewhat similar to, it kind of depends on the philosophy of time. So if eternalism is true, I would want a timeless God, more like Brian Leftow's view. But if presentism is true, I would probably go with some kind of like divine temporality view along the lines of Ryan Mullins or others. But anyway, what do I think about some of the arguments? I think that I don't quite understand the fourth way. It's a bit difficult to wrap my mind around. I mean, I find the first way to be super duper fun to think about. I actually think that it's probably, I find it plausible that changes require some kind of cause. And I also find it plausible that per se chains cannot regress infinitely, because it's kind of like, it's a fundamentality chain. And so in contemporary metaphysics, you know, there's this notion of grounding. And a lot of people think that grounding chains are well-founded. It's like you can't have infinitely descending ground. And that's kind of very similar to what the, you know, classical theistic tradition has been saying, like, all along about per se chains. So it's like, it's really interesting. So I find that plausible. But yeah, I mean, I guess, am I answering the way that you thought I would? Or the way that you wanted? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. So question,
going.
maybe that exhausts our round of questions. Okay. I'll guess I'll ask a question about one of my arguments. So let's focus on the changing knowledge argument. So I take it that we both agree that there's change. I also take it that, well, I find it plausible that if there's change, then some things go from being true to being false. Like, you know, if the water goes from being frozen to not being frozen, well, then that the water is frozen goes from being true to being false. But how do you try to avoid God's knowledge in that case changing? Because it really does seem really plausible to my mind that knowledge is factive, in the sense that one cannot know a falsehood. And so if the truths themselves change, well, then the knowledge itself cannot remain unchanged, because knowledge has to track truth. Knowledge is factive. If the truths themselves change, the knowledge itself has to change. And so given that we know that the truths themselves change, it just seems really plausible to my mind. And I don't say that everyone has to share this, but it seems super duper plausible to my mind that knowledge itself would then have to change. So how do you avoid God's knowledge changing?
Yeah, I think the standard way by which to defend this claim is to drive a hard bargain on the divine ideas. Which is to say that God is his existence. He is his intellect. He is his active intellection. He is the object of his intellection. So God knows the divine essence, and he knows all things in knowing the divine essence. And so I used the example earlier of a playwright. And maybe, like say like that playwright is at the premiere of his play. Let's say that they're staging at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And one of his friends, he's got one of those folks sitting next to him who's chatty. They're accustomed to watching movies and doing mystery science theater, so they just can't help themselves even when they're at a theater venue. And the person is just kind of chiming in as to what he or she thinks about how the plot is unfolding. And maybe at one point, 40 minutes in, they're like, wow, this guy, he's really got it coming to him. And it ends up being comedic at the end. And truth be told, he didn't have it coming to him. Like, what would the playwright respond at 45 minutes? He'd be like, yeah, crazy, right? Hard to say. Wait, let's see. Like he could respond in a variety of ways, but he's written the play in such a way that you are to think that he's got it coming to him. But he knows how it ends. He knows how it transpires. He knows every aspect of it because all of it is accounted for in his generative act. And so for him, it's not a matter of a thing going from being false to true or from true to false. It's a matter of capturing the reality in its entire dispensation as pre-contained in the divine essence, upon which the divine idea is styled, to which he conjoins his divine power, and through which he brings it about. So I guess that'd be a short answer.
Yeah, and I'll just let you ask me maybe one final question before Q&A. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I want to push back, but like that would take way too long. So
yeah. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? You think me ask a question, or you want to just open it up for other people?
What would you like? Would you like to ask him one final question, or should we just move to Q&A? You don't care?
I don't. Yeah.
I could probably say my favorite saint. Yeah, I like
nice.
Saint
Let's
Augustine. Saint Augustine's probably my favorite. I really enjoy reading his work. Sometimes he gets super spicy and like, oh my goodness, he drops the insults and they're hilarious.
You should read Saint Jerome.
No, because Augustine, I think he was trained as like a Roman orator or something like that, or a rhetorician or something. I don't know, but yeah, I don't like him just for the spice, but like he's very insightful. He's accessible, and his appreciation and love for the truth. He has this beautiful passage in one of his works on the truth. He's like just meditating on truth, and it's so beautiful. And yeah, it just really touched me. It was wonderful. So he's absolutely my favorite.
Awesome. Well, since you told me I can do whatever I want, I'm going to tell you about Catholic chemistry. So, if you are a Catholic and you think you're being called to marriage, you can't go past Catholic chemistry. Click the link in the description below so that they know that we sent you. This was founded by a good friend of mine, Chuck Gallucci. That's actually his head right there. The two of us used to work together at Catholic Answers. This is a website that garners very faithful Catholics who are serious about their faith. Who aren't just Catholic by name, and most of them probably don't know what divine simplicity is, but that doesn't matter, they're still Catholic. So you can go to Catholic Chemistry today and sign up, find yourself a nice Sheila or blokey bloke, and they also have online video chatting. So if you kind of encounter somebody, you want to chat with them, you don't want to give out your number because they could be a weirdo, you can chat directly over the website, which makes things easy. I've known of several people who have met their spouse here. My wife actually, I think, interviewed Chuck Gallucci's wife, and she spoke of several people who met their spouse here. So go check it out. What do you got to lose? Don't answer that. I don't know. There might be something, but just shut up. It's always the problem with philosophical discussions, right? You ask something like that, what do you have to lose? You're like, oh, I've got like 1,000 things I could lose. All right. Well, this has been absolutely riveting, and I look forward to listening to it again so I can try to understand some of it. It definitely is... Yeah, it's good. All right, I guess let me kind of ask a couple of questions first. Could you, Father Pine, is there a way to sort of alter how we understand divine simplicity if you think some of Joe's arguments landed well? Is there a way to kind of modify your understanding of divine simplicity, or is it sort of set in stone the way you've understand it because in your estimation that's what the church has said, so it's not really up for debate?
No, I think there are a variety of ways in which one could argue for divine simplicity, and I don't know that I'm saying mine is the best because I haven't surveyed the other options, truth be told. I am, I've kind of habitual trust of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the things that I have inquired into, I have found to bear the weight of argumentation. And so I just kind of extend that through how he envisions reality because it's articulated, because it kind of hinges, as it were, on certain principles and then flows from that. But I know in the conception of Duns Scotus, for instance, that he doesn't make some of the moves that St. Thomas Aquinas does. And I know that Gloria Frost has written a couple things in the past 10 years about that very thing. And whether or not that seems preferable to you, in an argumentative context will depend upon your fundamental presuppositions or the types of conceptual embarrassments you think you arrive at with Thomism. And just to be honest, there are things that I have difficulty understanding, but I'm still of the kind of habitual disposition that I don't judge the text, I am judged by it. So I find it really hard to account for the causally pluripotent nature of God's creative will. It's just like, I think some of Joe's arguments about, God's not changing and engaging with a changing reality, as it were, or the fact that God could or could not have created, and that represents no real distinction in God. A lot of those things for me are just very obscure in the sense that, like, sometimes you feel, I see through a glass darkly, and sometimes you feel like I see through a glass darkly. And it's at those points where you just have to be honest and say, I don't see this, right? So there are elements of belief in what I propose, which I think epistemically makes it sometimes hard to track. So if, a listener is saying like, yeah, I kind of got some of that, but also it seemed like some hand waving was going on. And in a certain sense, that's because like they're just very, very obscure concepts, right? And I mean, part of what animates the argumentation for me is doxological, because I think that in the beatific vision, the principal delight will be the vision of God. But I think that one of the secondary delights will be to see these divine attributes reconciled. One of the ones that strikes closest to home for many people is, God's permission of evil. So how is God good? How is God beneficent? And how does he permit evil? For us, that is a very, very obscure thing. But I think that in heaven, we'll see that in the context of God's love designs, in the context of his providence. And it's not as if we'll have comprehensive knowledge with it, but we'll have a greater sympathy with it. And I think that things like this, with divine simplicity, a similar thing can be said. Insofar as, how does God interact with a complex reality, himself being simple? I think that's very difficult to parse. But I think that thinking through it, even if it evades us, or even if we find it, hard, is saving. It's got this doxological character because we cultivate in desire what we hope to attain to in vision. So that's a thought.
Do you want to respond to that, Joe? Or at least, the question I was trying to say to Father Pine is like, okay, in your estimation, does Father Pine have to throw out divine simplicity entirely, or could he hold to a form of it that would still be, you could still call it that or not?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So this is actually this is a pretty big, it's pretty debatable in the literature. Like, I know some people, I think Thomas Williams might actually have a paper. What is it? Complexity Without Composition or something? I think that's what the title is, by Thomas Williams. He's a medieval scholar, also a scholar on Scotus. And I think they argue in that paper that, no, Scotus really should be interpreted as just rejecting divine simplicity, but other people really defend Scotus, and they're like, no, he has a distinctive version of divine simplicity, and he's perfectly, So there are debates there, and I can't really say too much. I mean, Scotus is my boy. Like, I love Scotus. He's just based and red-pilled. He's amazing. Yeah.
I got an idea for your next T-shirt.
Yes.
All right. Gavin, thanks for being a patron, Gavin. He says, Joe, if it was shown that divine simplicity was true, would you become a theist? Why or why not?
Well, so it depends on the divine simplicity. So I guess the divine aspect kind of already gives that away. But if we just showed that there was this absolutely simple principle that accounts for all composition, I wouldn't automatically become a theist. I would take classical theism to be the live option, along with a kind of a more Plotinian emanationist scheme where you have the one, which is prior to all else, which emanates all else. So the one, for those of you who don't know, is there's this philosopher he's a Neoplatonic philosopher named Plotinus. He had this kind of almost like a tripartite structure within his ontology. You have the one, which is just this absolute sense, all complexity, all multiplicity, all distinction. It even transcends the distinction between thought and object, or subject and object. So Paul Gavrilyuk, for instance, describes it as impersonal and things like that. So it's a kind of impersonal, utterly simple principle behind everything. And then the other two aspects of the tripartite structure are a kind of the nous, or the divine mind, which is this infinitely complex mind, which is the repository of the forms. And then you have, I think, what is it, the world soul or whatever, which is a little weird. I don't understand that part. But my point is just that I wouldn't automatically become a theist, because there's still this other option where it's a kind of Plotinian divine, or Plotinian simplicity, where the one is kind of just this impersonal principle behind everything. And it's just this utterly simple, transcends everything. So I'd be competing between Plotinianism, if you can call it that, and classical theism.
Father, you may have already responded to this, and maybe I didn't understand it, but it sounded like, Joe was saying you can kind of get out of this circularity by positing God as the source of his change. What was wrong with that argument? Because on the face of it, that sounded very reasonable.
Yeah. So, I guess I haven't thought deeply or in any extended fashion about the thing, but just continuing along the lines of what we've kind of trotted out to this point. I think that one of the things that you lose with that is the intelligibility of the givenness of creation. Because it seems to me that it's very important for St. Thomas that God is not composed of essence and existence. And St. Thomas gives a larger argument as to the significance of this in the De Ente et Essentia in chapter 4, which he wrote, relatively early in his career. I want to say like 1256 for Dominican philosophy students. But there, really, what you have is a kind of partitioning of reality. You either have being which subsists, or you have being which is caused, being which is given, being which is received, as it were. And it seems that that's an exhaustive dialectic. There aren't other options. And what you have with this kind of proposal that God is composed of parts and that he actualizes one part by another part is, I think that ultimately commits you to the fact that God does not subsist as being.
Oh, yeah.
Because once you end up there, then you lose the intelligibility of the type of argument that's advanced in the De Ente et Essentia. And then you have just a kind of strange dispensation when it comes to the giving and receiving of being, as it were. So I think that's like, that's where I would start.
Joe, you look like you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll really quickly respond. So this is kind of, so you did appeal kind of to the De Ente, which is like precisely my point. So, what's his name? This is exactly what Scott McDonald was saying. It's like, in order for the first way to work, you have to appeal to these things, like the De Ente argument. Like, it doesn't get you to classical theism on its own. You have to appeal to essence and existence and the metaphysics of esse and all that sort of stuff, in which case it doesn't succeed as an independent argument, but it's parasitic on the De Ente. So that was kind of, I don't know, it's like your response is almost like what I was getting at, right? It's like you have to move on to the essence existence points, and then now the non-classical theist will just come in and respond to those points, and we've set aside the first way, and now we're talking about essence and existence. And the non-classical theist will say, no, you can have a being in which essence and existence are numerically non-identical. They're numerically distinct, but that being can still be ultimate, because everything else is a contingent composite of essence and existence. This being is a necessary foundation of reality that's a perfect being. And there are various proposals on how you can explain how this is a foundation. It's not further caused, despite the fact that its essence and existence are distinct. They're necessarily conjoined and whatnot. So that's the rough sketch of how I'd respond.
Okay, thanks. Sean Basser asks, are the divine ideas distinct from each other, or are they ultimately one? Some of these will obviously take less time than others, but feel free to take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure. So St. Thomas Aquinas describes the divine ideas in a few places in his works. So he describes them in the first book of the Sentences Commentary, and distinction 36. He talks about them in the De Veritate, question 3. And I think that might be the longest treatment. There's like 8 articles and billions of objections. He kind of gestures towards them. I want to say it's like Summa Contra Gentiles, maybe book 1, chapters maybe 50 to 54-ish. But he doesn't really get into it because he's addressing a different question about divine knowledge. And then the most mature treatment is in the Summa Theologiae in Prima Pars, question 15. And the distinction, or the relative distinction of the divine ideas, is a hotly contested issue. So there's a big debate about it in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, maybe like 25 years ago. So James Ross was the one who kind of animated it, and he had responses there from Father Lawrence Dewan and from Armand Maurer, and then he himself kind of gave a Resolutio Magistris. But you had two camps, as it were. So on the one side is like Gilson and Maurer and Ross in a certain sense, and the other side would be like John Whipple and Lawrence Dewan.
Yeah.
And then that's a similar argument was rehearsed recently in, gosh, where was it? Modern Theology, maybe? No, that's wrong. Theological Studies between, let's see, Paul de Hart and Benjamin de Spain. And the argument, so it consists in this, in just this point on whether or not there are distinct ideas and whether God has ideas of possibles. So there's a kind of camp, as it were, not in like a tribal way, but there are folks who argue for the fact that God doesn't know apart from the createdness of the thing, as it were. So there's no real space, metaphysical space for pure possibles. That would be something that St. Thomas described in the De Veritate, and then he just moved on. He abandons it in the Summa Contra Gentiles, and it doesn't appear in the same way in the Summa Theologiae, because these divine ideas are specifically practical knowledge. So God doesn't have speculative divine ideas in the strict sense. So these practical divine ideas are exemplars, or to be distinguished then from rationes, which don't have the same kind of causal force. And folks of that persuasion will argue that God just knows the divine essence, and that possibles aren't really spun out. So you just have the divine essence, and then you have its instantiated forms, whereas you don't have this kind of middle ground. But then somebody as recently as Gregory Doolin will have argued that you do have ideas of possibles, insofar as God, in knowing of his essence, knows all of the distinct, enumerated, as it were, ways by which that essence can be participated in limited fashion. And his argument is great. He published a book with CEO Press in maybe like 2014. It's like Divine Ideas as Exemplar Causes, I want to say. And so they would be like rationally, or they would be distinct according to reason, as it were, but not really distinct insofar as there's no real distinctions in God apart from the Trinitarian processions. That is a kind of answer.
Yep. Okay. Sure.
Yeah, no, I'll just make a really brief point. That there's a kind of formula that you can use, which I was intimating in my opening statement. You ask yourself, would these things constitute, number one, positive ontological items that are, number two, numerically distinct from God? And so you can kind of use that as a way to test whether or not they would count as parts according to the classical theistic tradition. So, and I'm drawing heavily on the literature when I make that point about parthood and the classical theistic tradition typically understanding parthood in that manner. A positive ontological item intrinsic to something or within something distinct from that thing, which is precisely why you have this kind of formula. All that is in God is God. There are like books by like James Dolezal, for instance, where the literal title is All That Is in God. And so he's referring to that formula, all that is in God is God. So that's my response. That it's just a test for people to use. Ask yourself, would these divine ideas be positive ontological items? Would they have some positive reality in extramental reality? That's where you're getting to the point about the distinction of reason. Would they be positive ontological items in extramental reality are numerically distinct from God? So,
Mo asks, Dear Joe, doesn't the EDP get you into an infinite regress if the efficacious factors also require explanations which give us prior explanation? That word you used, explanatia.
Yes.
Oh.
Explanantia, yeah.
Thank you.
So that's a really good question. W. Matthews Grant raises that point, as well as in one, I think maybe that's in his 2019 book, and W. Matthews Grant and Mark K. Spencer raised that point in, I believe, a 2015 paper. And so I actually address this in a. I address this in a paper I have under review. So no, it doesn't require an infinitely descending chain of like distinct things that are explaining that are differentially factoring into the explanans, because the EDP applies only when there is an explanatory relation obtaining between the things in question. So in the case of classical theism, right, you can't deny that there's an explanatory connection, say, that there is an explanatory connection between creatures and God, right? You can't say that, oh no, creatures aren't explained in any way by God or anything. Like, no, that's heresy. Go, leave. So in that case, there is indeed an explanatory relation. And so the EDP only says that when there's an explanatory relation, differences in the explanandum presuppose differences in the total explanans, or the explanatory efficacious factors within the explanans. And so what we would deny, or to avoid this infinite regress, is to say, no, the explanations, the explanatory connections or explanatory relations bottom out at some point. And so you don't have a further explanatory connection between the explanandum and an explanans, such that you can have a further difference. So for instance, on non-classical theistic models of God, you would terminate presumably in something like differences in God's distinct creative act across worlds would be explained by different reasons and desires, say, differentially factoring into the explanation. But those differential factors and them differentially factoring into the explanation, those don't have some further underlying explanation, which is such that there are differences in that explanation. But the relevant point is that that's not a violation of the EDP, because EDP only applies when there is indeed such an explanatory connection obtaining. And we have principled reasons for thinking that there wouldn't be an explanatory relation obtaining there, because when you hit certain basic reasons, that you have an independent stopping point. You have a natural independent stopping point, what's called reasons foundationalism in the philosophical literature. It's kind of like epistemic foundationalism, where you have these basic beliefs that justify non-basic beliefs. You also have basic reasons, which are directly graspable by the intellect, and which provide a natural independent stopping point, so that you don't have to continually ask for reasons and reasons and reasons and so on. So,
Father Pine, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't know that this gets directly to the particular question or Joe's response to it, but with regard to the explanatory difference arguments in general, I think that, it's another example in which one is citing change and then looking for an ontological ground whereby that change is sufficiently accounted for in its causal source or in its causal foundation, if I've understood it correctly. And I think that, maybe just another word to say that God is, property A, or that God is property B, isn't to say that property A and property B, as we experience them in this world, are to be identified in an overly facile way. Mother Teresa's justice is Mother Teresa's mercy, to take an example from Alexander Proust. But it's to say that what those things name in God are identical. And I think that this gives us another conceptual tool whereby to account sufficiently for change within the creaturely dispensation. When we think about that change as pre-contained in God, right? Which God is the utmost or highest or perfect or primary instantiation of the thing which in our limited creaturely dispensation we encounter as such, right? So there's a real intelligible connection. But like in our experience of it, it's a property. In our experience of it, it may be an accident inhering in a substance with which it is composed. But in God, it subsists as God. So in God, God is wise by being himself, whereas other things are wise insofar as they are like God. And so a thing might change from being A to being B, but both of those things are pre-contained in God, and God's causal pluripotency accounts for the time-boundedness of that change and pre-contains causally and ontologically all that transpires from start to finish. So I think that the type of causal explanation, while it may not seem to us like a logically rigorous way by which to account for it, it has the ontological chops really to give it grounding.
Okay, why don't we do a couple more questions before leading into closing statements? I think this is a good question. A lot of people raise this question after examining the first way. Paul says, if everything, and we'll direct this to you, Father Pine, and then Joe, you can respond. If everything movable is moved by something else, then how do we account for human free will? Do free, undetermined choices imply that we are unmoved movers-ish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this would be an example of something being a cause in one register and caused in another register with respect to different modes of causality. So in St. Thomas's understanding, the will is an intellectual appetite. So it's the appetite attendant upon intellectual cognition. So the intellect causes the will in the formal order, right? So it gives it shape or it makes it to be what it is. And then the will is a kind of self-mover, right? Now, St. Thomas will argue that every act requires for its kind of initiation and concursus a kind of influx. Auxilium is the way by which he refers to it, whether in the order of nature or in the order of grace. So God kind of has to get the thing off the ground. That's another conversation, but actually, check this out. Oh man, this is like a little bit of a boast. I just rented this book out of the library. I had no idea that it was going to be this thick and this old, but this is like 600 pages on physical pre-motion by a guy named Doomermuth. I am jazzed out of my mind. So that's that. But with respect to free will, so we have free will in two senses, as St. Thomas describes it at the beginning there of the Prima Secundae, kind of in the way that he describes it in questions 6 through 10. So he says that we have freedom of exercise, which represents the kind of indeterminacy of the will with respect to goods that do not command its intention wholly. So you can always not do a thing on account of the fact that it's not so surpassing a good as to kind of overwhelm you, as it were, or to entirely bind you to its choice. And then he says we have freedom of specification. So intellectually, we're always free to see a thing under different lights or to kind of zoom in on certain aspects of it. So, okay, I'm in Switzerland and, they got lots of chocolate here. And I might be like, yeah, chocolate, delicious. But I also might think about it in light of the fact that we've been in the Easter season now for like 11 days. And if I look at another piece of sweet Swiss chocolate, I'm just going to like toss myself at a second story window. Okay. So it's like, it's a good thing, but in light of how the past 11 days have gone, I'm not feeling so keen on the prospect of eating another piece of chocolate. Right. So I'm not bound by it insofar as I am able to choose under which aspect I see the thing. But if I go downstairs and every other item of food has been entirely ransacked and all that's left is a 5-pound block of Toblerone, I'll be like, you know what? I'm really hungry, so I'm just going to put up with chocolate tonight. So there's this kind of liberty with respect to the intellect. So St. Thomas accounts for it both at the level of the will and at the level of the intellect. He has this space for a divine influx, as it were, and then also this space for formal causality provided by the intellect vis-a-vis the will. And I think, he holds that to be a sufficient explanation, provided that I have represented it adequately.
Joe, did you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it might depend. So the answer to that question might depend on how you cash out, freedom of the will. There are all sorts of different views in philosophy of action and whatnot. You could be an event libertarian, you could be an agent libertarian, you could take compatibilist routes. So there are lots of different ways I think you could go about navigating that question. And I would say the only way to really get a handle on the question is to spell out what account you have of freedom first and see how that would fit in with the causal principle, whether or not it violates it or not. It's funny that they use the term unmoved mover to describe us because Rod Chisholm actually used that to describe a kind of agent causal libertarian view where, like, in some sense, we are under that view unmoved movers. And people, of course, who were not so sympathetic to agent causal libertarian use that as kind of like weapons. They'd be like, we'd have to be like supernatural beings in order, So my short answer is I think the answer to the question will fall out of once you specify your metaphysics of action and freely willed action.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. Let's take 5 minutes each to offer closing statements. Let's see. So Father Pine went first. So Joe, you'll go first, and then Father Pine will close whenever you're. Oh well, feel free to set your own timer, but I'll set one as well.
All right. I will set mine. So I didn't prepare anything for this, but we're just gonna go extemporaneous. So I really enjoyed this. I appreciated this conversation. I always think that dialogue across ideological barriers, as it were, is such a great way to sharpen our own ideas, gain greater appreciation for the ideas of others, really try to intellectually empathize with others and see things from their perspective, not try to knock them down with arguments, but rather using arguments as tools, right? Tools meant to serve others and serve a dialectic, not as weapons designed to attack or to knock down or show how you can decisively prove or demonstrate your own position and your premises are rationally certain and indefeatable. So I view arguments really as tools, and so I hope people, when they're reflecting on some of the arguments that I gave, and to be sure there are many different arguments that I could have given that I didn't, and I had to cut down, and all of these sorts of things. But when people are reflecting on them, just keep in mind that arguments are always meant to be tools. They're designed to serve, and they're not designed to be weapons. And so, for just a summary of this discussion, I gave those 5 arguments at the beginning. I believe it was. Well, let's see if I can remember them. One of them was the changing knowledge argument. One of them was the aloneness, the explanatory difference, the propositions argument, and then the providential collapse argument. To my mind, I still find them eminently plausible after our discussion. So I still think that they hold force and significant force, to my mind at least, even after our discussion. I really enjoyed probing them with Father Pine. And so, and then with regard to some of the arguments for classical theism that we saw, my main objection here was that I think that non-classical theistic models of God can easily accommodate and respond to them such that they don't support classical theism in particular, and so they wouldn't show divine simplicity. So that was my main contention in responding to those arguments. And to be sure, there are other ways that are non-theistic to go about responding to some of these arguments. To those curious, you can check out on my YouTube channel. I've done videos on the first way, the third way, and lots of other stuff. So I just really enjoy thinking about these issues. And so, I guess I'll just end with gratitude to both of you guys. I really appreciated this, and I had so much fun wearing my favorite shirt and talking about one of my favorite topics, and it's just all fun. I got my beer, even though I'm underage. This is definitely not beer; it's water. But yeah. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Father Pine, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I too got to wear my favorite shirt. So I think maybe just some closing comments about philosophy and theology and the setting of this. I think that sometimes, and I borrow some of this from Alistair McIntyre, it can be genuinely difficult to host substantive exchange between or among different traditions. And I don't want to make this sound too skeptical or too despair-filled about the possibility of that. But I think that, many people's experiences, certainly of like political exchanges, has convinced them as to the futility of trying to change another person's mind. And Matt McIntyre has this kind of extended argumentation about emotivism, where he says that emotivism basically departs from the understanding that, it's like a kind of intuitionism. You have these pre-commitments, and then you're arguing for them is just but the semblance or guise of rational exchange. And truth be told, you're just doing advocacy, and you only ever think or know your position to be true to the extent that it gains adherence. So rather than real argumentation, you just end up with a kind of demagoguery. And when I first encountered this argumentation, I was like, holy moly, this guy, he's just saying the things, and the things are true. But he proposes in 3 rival versions this idea of becoming a native speaker of another language. And I guess just to commend Joe for learning Thomism, right? To seeking to learn Thomism, and to doing so with with an openness as to its conceptual content and the resources that it affords for thinking about God, for thinking about reality. I think we would joke in formation that sometimes we would learn other philosophical or theological traditions the way that an American gunner in the Second World War would learn the different types of bodies of like German airplanes. You only need to know it well enough to pick it out and shoot it down, right? But I think that there's something real to be said, and not in like a condescending or like intellectual head patting kind of way, for knowing other things. I struggled a lot with modern philosophy and contemporary philosophy, and I was just like so riddled with sorrow and despair. But you see that if it is a common project in the of inquiry for the purpose of sacred truth, described according to the Catholic tradition, then you're going to be able to identify whatever is said, regardless of by whom, if true, as inspired by the Holy Spirit, and as leading ultimately in a kind of symphonic way towards a joint testimony. And I think that this conversation just kind of gives me hope. I don't know. I'm smiling over here. I'm just encouraged. So I'm very grateful for that. But I think also another thing that it's convinced me of is to the poverty of philosophical discourse. And this isn't just to say like do philosophy for as long as you can and then give up and do theology. But I think that the dispensation of God's grace takes account of the limitations, the weakness of our human knowledge. And I think that when we try to follow arguments, we find it difficult. It's hard. And like one person or another might have a better knack for argumentation, or might have more keen insight, or might be more workmanlike in his or her ability to kind of suss out the implications. But ultimately, our minds are sometimes weighed down by the corporeal organs through which they at times operate. It might be your fourth cup of coffee and you might just be tuckered out by the whole thing. But that's okay, right? Because God reveals himself because it matters. Because otherwise it would take us a heck of a long time to get there. There'd be the admixture of much error, and it would only seemingly be for the wise. And so God makes himself known so that we can assent to that and so that we can have that life. So, that's not to say just, your get out of jail free card is belief. But St. Thomas teaches that even a little old lady, can know more about God than the wisest of philosophers. And that makes it hard to sort out, what do I believe and what do I know? Because it's hard to conduct that type of interrogation within one's own mind's eye. But it's all underwritten by this fact of God's having gone before us, which I take great encouragement from. So yeah, I'm encouraged in the philosophical discipline. I'm encouraged in the theological setting.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate the effort you both put into studying this topic in order to engage in this discussion. It was excellent. Just very quickly, Joe, where can people learn more about you, and then Father Pine?
Yeah, so you guys can mainly check me out at check me out. That's probably a weird way to put it. Yeah, like check me out. Like, let's see. I guess I should post. Okay, no. So you can find me at Majesty of Reason. That's my YouTube channel. It's so fun. I love it. I do lecture videos and discussion videos, and you can also check out my book. Final shameless promotion, but give me the link. Give me the link after this, would you, so I can throw it up in the description so people can. Yeah. Will do. But yeah, those are the main two things. Thanks, Father Pine.
Thanks. Check out our Tomistic Institute. So Aquinas101.com. Great course for learning the basics of St. Thomas's thought and teaching. And right now, TI is running a faith and science course with some Dominican friars and Karin Oberg, who teaches astrochemistry at Harvard. So about the coherence of the philosophical and theological world of St. Thomas, and then the kind of methodology of the modern sciences. And and then also check out Godsplaining. So contemplative preachers, contemporary age, just kind of contemplative insights into things of ordinary life, whether that be faith, life, whatever, politics or literature, philosophy, it doesn't matter. But just short 30-minute episodes, and then some meditations on the readings for Sundays, and then guests and blah, 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 and thus and such. So yeah, all good things.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for watching or listening. This has been fantastic. Just want to let you know about a couple of things we have coming up. Next week, I have 2 sit-down interviews, one with a real-life exorcist, Father Lampert. I'll also be interviewing Christopher West here in the studio. And next month, we have a debate between Jimmy Aiken, who is a Catholic apologist, and Lutheran Jordan B. Cooper on how we should understand justification. So we've always got great content coming out. If you want to make sure that you have access to that, please help us out by clicking that subscribe button and then that bell, and that way YouTube will be forced to basically evangelize you. And that's a good thing to force Google to do. Thanks. Bye.